All right, today we're moving back, just posterior from the frontal lobe, to take a deep dive into the parietal lobe. But we're not going to treat this as some simple sensory drop-off point, no. We're going to explore it as the master architect of action, the home of what are called praxicons, which are essentially the brain's internal learned formulas for how we actually interact with the world around us.
So here's the game plan. We'll kick things off with the key anatomical landmarks, then we'll dive right into the primary sensory cortex and its, well, really surprising role in motor function. From there, we'll unpack the whole concept of praxis and apraxia. We'll then investigate the dominant lobule's job, agnosis, and the very famous Gerstmann syndrome, and finally, we'll explore the absolutely fascinating syndromes of the non-dominant lobe. Okay, so first things first, where is the parietal lobe? Well, it's tucked right behind the central sulcus, holding a really crucial position between the frontal, temporal, and occipital lobes. For our purposes today, we're going to be focusing almost entirely on its superlateral surface.
Let's break down the functional organization here. Our starting point is the post-central gyrus. This is the primary sensory cortex. Now, everything behind it makes up the posterior parietal lobule. And a really key landmark here is the intraparietal sulcus, which neatly divides this lobule into a superior part, which you can think of as the factory for our praxicons, and an inferior part, which is home to the supramarginal and angular gyri. And those are critical for recognition and symbolic processing.
So let's zoom in now on that post-central gyrus, also known as Brodmann areas 3, 1, and 2. Now, its name really implies a purely sensory function, right? But here's the twist. It is deeply, deeply intertwined with the motor system, and that's an absolutely crucial point that often gets overlooked. Get ready for this, because it's a staggering fact. 40% of the brain's corticospinal motor fibers, the ones that control movement, actually originate from this primary sensory cortex. To put that in perspective, the primary motor cortex itself only contributes about 30%. This one anatomical detail explains everything about why a lesion right here causes not just sensory loss, but pretty significant motor weakness.
So, clinically, what happens when there's a lesion in the post-central gyrus? Well, you get a pretty predictable set of signs. First off, you'll see contralateral upper motor neuron weakness. That means weakness on the opposite side of the body. Interestingly, muscle tone isn't as affected because that's mainly a job for the premotor areas. But the real hallmark, the dead giveaway, is the loss of what we call cortical sensations. These are the complex sensory interpretations like stereognosis, identifying an object just by touch, or graphesthesia, recognizing a number traced on your palm. Those abilities are just gone.
All right, moving on to the superior parietal lobule, we've arrived at the central theme of our entire discussion today, praxicons. Now, this is an abstract concept, but it is absolutely vital. A praxicon is basically the brain's pre-programmed formula for pulling off a skilled action. It's the internal how-to guide for movement.
So here's the crucial point. A praxicon isn't the movement itself. It's the sensory-guided recipe. It's the stored information that lets you do things like tie your shoes, or use a key in a lock, or strike a match, without having to consciously think through every single tiny little movement. It's the know-how.
Now, when this formula gets lost because of a lesion in the superior parietal lobule, the result is something called apraxia. And what makes apraxia so distinct, so fascinating, is that the patient isn't weak, they're not numb, they're not uncoordinated, they understand the command perfectly. They have simply lost the internal knowledge of how to perform the task. The recipe is gone.
The matchbox test is a classic clinical example of this. The goal is super simple. Light a match. But just look at the sequence of actions that are required. It all relies on a very precise internal formula. A patient with apraxia will fail, not because they can't physically pick up a match, but because the sequential program, the praxicon, to achieve that goal has been totally corrupted or erased.
We're going to shift our focus now, moving inferiorly to the inferior parietal lobule of the dominant hemisphere. This area contains two real heavyweights of cognitive function. The supramarginal gyrus, which is associated with object recognition or gnosis, and the angular gyrus, famously linked to a whole collection of highly specific symbolic deficits.
Gnosis is really just the ability to recognize things, and when you lose it, that's called agnosia. In visual agnosia, a patient can see an object perfectly, their eyes are working just fine, but their brain can't attach any meaning to it. They might see a lamp, but they can't name it. This very specific problem is tied to the functioning of the supramarginal gyrus, which works together with nearby parieto-occipital association areas.
Okay, So, having explored all those very specific functions of the dominant lobe, we're now going to turn to the unique and absolutely vital role of the non-dominant parietal lobe, which is typically on the right side. While the left hemisphere is usually dominant for language, the right hemisphere has its own profound jobs, and damage here produces some of the most bizarre syndromes in all of neurology.
So there's this critical asymmetry in how our brain monitors the world around us. The left parietal lobe only pays attention to the right side of space. In stark contrast, the right parietal lobe attends to both the left and the right sides. This functional redundancy is the whole reason why a left parietal lesion doesn't cause spatial neglect, but a right parietal lesion is absolutely catastrophic for a person's awareness of their entire left world.
So, a lesion to this non-dominant lobe results in a classic constellation of 5 syndromes, and each one represents a profound loss of function. Patients develop what's called constructional apraxia, losing the ability to perceive geometric relationships. They'll show dressing apraxia, unable to orient their own clothing to their body. They experience visospatial disorientation, hemispatial neglect of their entire left world, and topographic agnosia, which means they get lost even in the most familiar places.
Hemispatial neglect is just profoundly strange. For the patient, their left world literally ceases to exist. They'll only eat food from the right side of their plate. They'll shave or put on makeup on only the right side of their face. They'll draw a clock, but only include the numbers 1 through 6. And in its most severe form, which is called anosognosia, they will vehemently deny that their own left arm or leg even belongs to them.
So beyond these big cognitive syndromes, parietal lesions also produce a very distinct visual field defect. Because the optic radiations sweep up through the parietal lobe, a lesion here causes an inferior homonymous quadrantenopia. That's a loss of the lower quadrant of vision on the opposite side. A little mnemonic helps distinguish this from a temporal lobe lesion. Parietal damage gives you pie on the floor, while temporal gives you topping on the pie or pie in the sky.
All right, let's head back to the dominant hemisphere, usually the left one, to talk about Gertzmann's syndrome. This is a unique, classic neurological condition that's caused by a lesion in one very, very specific spot, the angular gyrus.
Gertzmann's syndrome is defined by a very specific group of 4 deficits: agraphia, which is the inability to write; acalculia, the inability to do calculations; finger anomia, which is the inability to name their own fingers; and right-left disorientation. It is just a striking example of how these highly specific and seemingly unrelated symbolic functions are all localized to one tiny little gyrus.
Now, that angular gyrus lesion also causes alexia, the inability to read, which goes along with the agraphia. This is something you have to distinguish from alexia without agraphia, where a patient can write perfectly fine but then can't read their own writing. That's a disconnection syndrome from a lesion somewhere else. And both of those are distinct from pure alexia, from a fusiform gyrus lesion, where patients can only read letter by painful letter.
And so, that brings us right back full circle to our central unifying theme. From processing our body's position in space, to guiding a hand to use a tool, to navigating an entire environment, the parietal lobe's fundamental role is the creation and execution of praxicons. It's the architect of the formulas that translate sensation into meaningful action.
And this leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The parietal lobe takes in all this raw sensory data, it integrates it, and it builds the internal models, the praxicons that we use to act. It doesn't just perceive the world, it builds the functional user interface for how we interact with it. So the question then isn't just whether this lobe creates our reality, but whether it is the master architect of our very ability to act within it.